Hey guys, so we've been talking about this idea that structure is a key piece of our health because our body was designed to operate from a certain position, and the further away we get from that, the more aches and pains can come through our body. So when we're talking about migraine headaches, and when I've worked with people with migraine headaches, one of the number one things that I hear is, like, I got this so tight in my neck, like it feels like it's pulling, it feels like it's wrenching. I stretch, I do all this stuff and never lets go, like why? And what we're going to talk about today is fascia, because if you haven't heard of it before, it's one of the hottest areas in orthopedic research right now, and it's essentially this kind of the saran wrap that goes around your muscles, it goes around your internal organs, and even 5-10 years ago, people just thought it was this stuff that you wanted to get out of the way as you were trying to examine other things in the body. So what they're finding though is it's actually hugely key foundational to how our body operates in space, not only from a movement perspective, but from a postural perspective as well. So we're going to dig into this a little bit more because, again, it's supposed to act like these nice gliding sheets. And even for how people thought the human body moved, the whole thing's just getting blown out of the water right now with what they're learning about fascia. Because the old idea that I was taught when we were going through school is basically the human body is this series of kind of hydraulic pistons, the muscle contracts and a movement occurs. One muscle contracts, a movement occurs. So what they're finding is that's actually not really true. Just muscle pulls by themselves wouldn't be enough to coordinate all this dynamic movement that we can do as human beings. So fascia is kind of like these huge sling rubber bands that operate all throughout the body. So again, we can come all the way across our back, all the way across our midfront. The idea here is when you pull your finger back and let it go, we have this elasticity to our body, and fascia is what provides that. So when it's operating normally, it's in these nice organized sheets. It glides really well, it moves really well, it's really nice and stretchy. Everything's working well, everything's feeling really well. Unfortunately, what happens to a lot of people is it starts to densify over time. And a good analogy here is if you've ever filled up a sponge with water and then just set it on the counter and let it dry out. You know how it gets kind of hard and brittle and kind of gross? Your fascia does the exact same thing. If it's underused, if it's not being used appropriately, or if there's been direct injury or scarring around that area, all three of those things can cause fascia to densify, and then it doesn't work like it should. It's dehydrated, it doesn't stretch, it doesn't glide. So now when people are talking about oh, I have a muscle knot and all those kind of things, again, what they're finding is your muscle doesn't tie into knots. Some muscles sometimes will work harder and that can cause them to become a little more dense. But really, a lot of that constriction and tying up that's happening is actually happening in this fascial tissue. So the idea here is when you have a densification, it's kind of like if somebody's pulling on your shirt. Everything starts to constrict. So the densification happens here, and then it has this whole pulling effect, and it can happen all over the body. So again, I've heard weird stuff for people like this, where it's oh, I press here in my back, and I feel it up in my neck. And what their doctors or whatever tell them is well, that's not possible because there's no muscle connection there. But again, with our fascial sheets, they're really big. They go all the way from the hips up into the shoulders and the neck. Likewise, they can wind all the way down your leg. So if you get a pull at even one area, it can really affect a lot of different things. So it's highlighting this idea that the body's way more interconnected than we ever thought possible. And again, we are really relying heavily on fascia to be operating appropriately in order to be able to move and feel like we want to. So that constriction, that densification that we're talking about, what happens there is it happens at what's called the center of coordination. So again, the fascia works in certain ways, and because of that, it has a tendency to densify and constrict at certain areas within that sheet. So that's called the center of coordination. So that's actually where that densification happens. Now the interesting part here is it usually pulls further down the line in what's called the center of perception. But you can also think that as the center of pain. So again, if you have someone tugging on your shirt like this, the densification is happening here, but you may feel the pull happening over here. So in your body, this happens all the time again. Really common trigger point for people, a really common tension point is this area right underneath the skull. And same thing, it's oh, it just feels awful, I'm trying to dig into it, I can't release it, what do I do? And the issue a lot of times is, even though the pain's up here, the pull is happening all the way down here, and in this case, that center of coordination happens at the top of the shoulder blade. So as we look back at that, it's easy to see why a lot of people feel frustrated, and it's easy to see why a lot of people with migraine headaches are dealing with a lot of this tension that's happening here. It's because the lives we live aren't very kind on our necks and our backs to begin with. We're spending a lot of time sitting on chairs, sitting in front of the couch, sitting in the car. like a lot of our lives is like this. Like we're really designed to operate on two legs and like having all this good rotational dynamic movement. And unfortunately, a lot of times we're in this static, like looking at the computer, looking at just stuff that's right here in front of us. And we're not getting these movement patterns that our bodies were kind of designed for. And the top of the neck is one of the areas that gets highlighted the quickest because it has such a large job to do. It's supposed to move a ton, it's supposed to support the weight of the heavy head. So what happens again is we have all this constriction that happens, it pulls down at the top of the neck, the whole thing gets irritated, but if you're trying to massage here, if you're trying to stretch out here, while that center coordination is the actual problem that's pulling on everything, again, it becomes super frustrating. So that's an overview of the problem that goes on with fascia. Essentially, we get dehydrated, we get constricted, it starts pulling from different areas and creating pain at sites further away down the body. In our next video, what we're going to talk about is what we can actually do about that to open up that densification, return back to that normal state, and get things feeling like you want it to.